Hello, yeah, whatever, man. Your video puts in mind a clarification rather that I already wanted to make. It seems to me in a lot of the thinking here that we really have a problem in the terms. People find things that I say very confusing when I find them simple, and what it really is, I think, is how we break down the terms. You see some hard and fast distinctions in areas where I see, gradients and grayscales and spectrums of possibility. Okay, so for example, in the distinction between public and private rights, and this affects this issue of negative rights that you were discussing, which I do understand. There's something to that distinction, but like all distinctions, it breaks down in some cases, and it's important to study what cases, and we can get to that analysis by trying to look at private and public, and what do we really mean, and is there really a very clear distinction between the two. Now, this is a perfect example of a distinction that works most of the time, but when we think that there's a fundamental distinction, we're mistaken, because organizations can be looked at with a private perspective or a public perspective, as I hope you'll see in this example. So first of all, let's say we have some facility that's used by, let's just say, hundreds of people, and has one owner. That's obviously an example of a private ownership. If we change that to 2 or 3 owners, that's still private, but as we add, tens and hundreds of owners, there starts to be a community of owners, and among those owners, the property of that joint venture is something like public property for the ownership. So consider that you have a situation where a bunch of wealthy people want to start a golf club. So they pool their money together and they start a golf club, and you can buy in to this golf club for $500,000 and have a lifetime membership. Well, when they do that, they put all the property of that golf club in common. They can all use those facilities. And suddenly you have something that is even more like a public facility, right? Because it serves all of the members of this group. And we have the consumers and the users of this resource as the owners as well, and we start to consider that public. But of course, this is still a private situation. We're talking about a private club. It's only public if you take the public to be that community of owners. But of course, you can take the public to be just that community, because when we talk about the public, we always are talking about subgroups of the whole. We're not talking about all 6 billion people. We're talking about groups that form a community, and with respect to that community, they are the public. So now take my thought experiment about government. What if government is just seen as a private organization? Because see, we can do this. We can say that it's like that club. All the citizens are owners. Now, there's certain drawbacks to viewing your government this way, but I think we end up satisfying all the libertarian requirements. Suddenly, everything that's done bad by the government would be called good by the libertarians suddenly if it was a private organization doing them. It would have every right, except for one thing, that it doesn't actually ask for consent. And that's why I would say, to make it comply with the sort of private property ownership principles that market anarchists and many kinds of libertarians advocate, all we would have to change is we would have to make the government allow people to really decline to consent. But in that case, they would have to leave the nation. They would have to leave our property, just as you would have to leave the property of the golf club if you were not a member, if you did not pay your dues. All right. Now, one reason I say this isn't a sufficient model is it can be bent into service, but basically there's an element that's wrong, which is that the idea that you lose your rights if you don't pay your fee. And I don't actually believe that. I believe that somebody that doesn't pay taxes should still have their rights protected. For example, if someone steals from them, that still counts as thievery, and that criminal can be prosecuted even though they haven't paid their fees and therefore have not paid for the service of police protection with respect to being robbed. But you can, as I say, bend this into the model, because in the case of that country club, we could find the same thing, that maybe if you are on the country club property, that you're given the benefit of the doubt. And we do this actually for legitimate members, so that if there's a computer glitch and they're not listed on the membership sheet, or there's a problem, they know they're not going to be hassled. And so there's a kind of due process, even for those that will eventually be kicked off. In the meanwhile, while they're on the property, if we have rules of treating people civilly, then we can follow those rules. We can do all these kinds of things, even though they haven't given a fee. And it's really because it's in our discretion what to do when someone doesn't pay the fee that they're required to pay to use our private property or our property held in common. So public property is really just private property held in common by a group, where the rights are to use that property are distributed. So there isn't a clear fundamental distinction between private and public, and it becomes part of a perspective. When you look at things from the private perspective, you're talking about people that have an absolute right to their property. And when you look from a public perspective, you're talking about people that share a right to that property. And I think if you use this realization of what is the arbitrary part of this distinction between private and public, that you'll start to see that some of the condemnations of government just don't really work. And why? Because according to the principle used to criticize the government, we could actually have a government that satisfied all those criticisms without changing functionally. It could be the same government, doing the same things, making the same demands, but doing those on a private property basis, and suddenly that would be okay. Well, listen, if there's something wrong with the way the government's working, then changing what everything's called and leaving that functionally the same cannot possibly be the solution. So there must be another solution.